Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for that very kind introduction, Ruth, and Bahia for that incredible presentation. I'm sure you were all as moved by it as I was, and what an incredible reminder that kind of landscapes of resistance are written into the walls and streets around us, even when other parts of the world that we can see are more dispiriting. I'm going to build on some of the themes that Bahia was referring to and try and link them to things that are going on here in Britain at the moment and also more globally. And in doing so, hopefully bring up some of the themes that Stuart's work spoke to so powerfully and so relevantly, and I think still have so much to say about the moment we're in today. In 2004, Stuart Hall sat down with the broadcaster Philip Dodd to reflect on his life so far and on the political reality that surrounded them. It had been a quarter of a century since the advent of Thatcherism and the start of a new political paradigm, one that Hall illuminated and interrogated better than anyone right from the outset, most notably in his 1979 essay, The Great Moving Right Show. Since then, Francis Fukuyama had proclaimed the end of history, and a new Labour government had come to power that shared many of Thatcher's basic political instincts, ushering in an era of managerialism, technocracy, and gradualism, one in which the horizons of political imagination and of ideology were tightly bordered. I feel the world as stranger to me than I ever felt before, Hall told Dodd, adding that for the first time in his life, he felt out of time. He went on to explain that something had turned fundamentally in the late 1970s, that a system change had taken place in which all that was solid had melted into air, and the parameters in which political debate could take place had suffocatingly closed in. And then he said something else, quietly and certainly. It will unravel, he warned. Since that unraveling will mean the death or suffering of large numbers of people, I can't say I'm glad about that. But unravel in a way that I can't now predict, I don't have any doubt at all. 6 years on from Stuart's death, we are all living in real time through that unraveling. A moment, once again, like the late 1970s, in which things are falling apart, and we can feel the birth pangs of contested futures all around us. It began in 2008 with a financial crisis that upended the global economy and the stories that were told to justify it. And it's developed since into an amorphous churn that is scrambling elections and governments, nations and nationalisms, culture and identities, a churn that fills the air around us and seeps into all the cracks. Today, I want to explore briefly what it's like to live through such an unraveling, about its complicated relationship to resistance, and about the hopes and dangers that are lodged within it. And to do so, I'm going to talk about two young people who live thousands of miles apart, Kyle in Oldham, Lancashire, and Kamal in Cairo, that we've just been seeing the amazing images of. Kyle and Kamal have never met. Their circumstances and their life contexts are in many ways entirely different. And yet, despite those differences, I think there are some threads which bind them together, threads that perhaps bind all of us together, and which maybe tell us something useful about the ongoing unraveling that Stuart so rightly predicted. Kamal is a friend and a colleague of mine in Egypt from where I've just returned, and needless to say, having heard Bahia's presentation, Kamal is not his real name. He's in his mid-20s, and he has curly hair and an unruly beard. He's from Port Said, originally on the Mediterranean, but in 2011, when the revolution started, he came to Cairo because it was there that yesterday was crumbling. And if you saw something promising in that crumbling, something that made tomorrow look brighter, then Cairo was where you wanted to be. On the day it all began, he passed out in the fighting and woke up handcuffed to a hospital bed. When he tells the story of his escape, which involves a sympathetic nurse and a botched attempt to drug the police guard, and many nights spent in the torture cells of Gebel al-Ahmar, the Red Mountain district of the capital where several security buildings are located, Kamal's eyes widen and vivify. He rocks back and forth impulsively on his seat. He has the same look when he remembers the marches, the feeling of the air distorting as police panicked, dropped their weapons and fled, the giddiness of watching the ground around him tilt a little and power seemingly slide out from behind high walls and watchtowers and darkened windows down towards the streets. The overwhelming vitality of finally being able to write his own story rather than playing a bit part role in somebody else's. These days, however, more often than not, Kamal's eyes are slightly glazed and they rest on the middle distance. Kamal counts out the beats of his adult life by the political events that have shaped it, most of which have been concerned with resistance and the actions of those seeking to thwart it. Comedy show X came out after Rally Y, but before court decision Z. So-and-so's friend got married 3 weeks after that massacre. They took their honeymoon just as that sit-in was getting underway. Places and times collapse into one another, which is a messy business when you're physically navigating a metropolis as large as Cairo, while simultaneously trying to keep the ghosts of the past at bay. Mustafa Mahmoud, which we were just hearing about, is a street to the southeast of Tahrir Square, but in Kamal's mind, it's also November 2011, when protesters battled to reach the Interior Ministry and the police resisted, as Bahia was telling us, by blinding them with birdshot. Ittihadiyya is the presidential palace in leafy Heliopolis, but it's also December 2012 and the fierce fighting between supporters and opponents of the Muslim Brotherhood. Rabaa al-Adawiyya is in suburban Medinat Nas near the stadium, but it's also August 2013 and the time Islamist demonstrators wrote the names and phone numbers of their parents on their arms so that their bodies would be identified, and the ensuing slaughter that left 1,000 people dead. Kamal's not an Islamist, but he knew 7 individuals who were killed at Rabaa. The first time I was arrested and beaten, I was 19, he told me once, matter-of-factly. The first time I carried a corpse, I was 20. Military service in Egypt is mandatory for those insufficiently moneyed or connected, and Kamal has been extending a long-finished undergraduate degree for years in an effort to avoid being called up. But he knows he can't do that indefinitely. He could get out of the country and try to claim asylum in Europe, but then he wouldn't be able to return and see his mother, who has hepatitis, the same disease which killed his father, and she relies on his support. So he stays and smokes weed and plays backgammon, because that way he can avoid talking. I've become a master in backgammon, he told me. I concentrate on playing because I don't want anyone to ask, how are you? And because I don't want anyone to ask the next question, which is, what happened? Or the question after that, which is, what will you do now? Every few weeks, the isolation gets too much. In the aftermath of the Rabaa massacre, unable to find a common language with the large numbers of people who cheered on the state's violence, but also desperate for human contact, Kamal pretended to be interested in renting a flat and accompanied a simsar, or property broker, around several Cairo apartments purely so he could indulge in conversation. He chatted with landlords about utility bills and deposit arrangements and walking distances to the metro, because all of that was so much simpler than talking about the things he'd seen in the morgue. He describes Cairo, the city he came to because it promised to open every door, as an open prison. I'm just waiting, he declared abruptly during one of our conversations. I'm just waiting, and I don't know what for. I asked Kamal once about imaginative horizons and how they expand and contract, about his capacity to visualize a different future. The expectations we had, they didn't just disappear, he replied. They became their complete opposite. It's not that our dreams didn't come true, it's that we tasted them and then they turned into the worst of nightmares. I think that when high hopes are suppressed, they become a deep sadness because energy, you know this from physics, right? Energy never dies. It has to turn into something else, another kind of energy or action. But here, there's no outlet for any of that, just a vacuum. A continent away, in a small room on the outskirts of Greater Manchester, Kyle is flying pteranodons, his feet in stirrups, body half upright to take the reins, surface noise fading to zero. Like Kamal, Kyle takes refuge in games, not backgammon in his case, but an Xbox video game called Ark, which is populated by fantastical creatures. Up high, Kyle explained to me, there's nothing to thud against your eardrums but the soft grunt of the creature's breath, the rhythmic flapping of its wings. When Kyle speaks of the things he sees from pteranodons, the crags and overhangs of great granite mountains, sweeping waterfalls throwing up huge clouds of water, mottled plains so vast that it's impossible to tell where or if they come to an end, his eyes shine and his frame slants forward, bobbing with excitement. It looks as if a part of him is launching into flight, even as we talk. One of the reasons Kyle is so enraptured by computerized life in the air is because he spent so much of his physical life on the ground. Some of that ground lies at the western end of Manchester's Ashton Canal, on the pedestrianised ramp that leads down from the Piccadilly Station concourse, in half crevices dotted along the edge of the concourse itself, in the elevator that ferries passengers between platform level and the trains. It was the only place I could find where the floor had a bit of warmth. Everything else was freezing, he said. Benches are the best, and air vents too. Then anywhere flat and sheltered where you can lay a blanket. There were times during the 2-year period in which he was homeless when Kyle had to get by on a single meal a day. At one point, he lost a stone in the space of a fortnight. It's weird, he told me. Being on the streets was kind of a relief because I felt like I could finally be myself and do what I wanted. I was still attending school. I hadn't stopped caring, but I wasn't looking forward to growing up. The first time we met, Kyle had just been placed in temporary accommodation by social services. He was 17 years old. Kyle is from Oldham, a town that once spun more cotton than all the spindles in France and Germany combined. Today, it's the most deprived urban community in Britain. Kyle took me on a tour, pointing out his old schools, the takeaway place in Rippenham Road where he used to work and that nearly everyone agrees is the best chippy in town, the beautiful and expensive homes nestled into the foothills of Saddleworth that seem forever distant and out of reach, and the streets around Shoulder, St Mary's, Shore Road and Durker that he knows much more intimately and now tries to avoid. We wound up at the estate where he grew up, staring out at the grassy fields that played host to his childhood football games, and up at the window onto what was once his bedroom. Kyle's mother still lives there, but we didn't knock on the door. It's fine. It's life, he said, when I asked if he was okay. It's what makes you who you are. When Kyle was 11, his mother was diagnosed with a mental health condition and suffered a series of breakdowns. Kyle became the primary carer for his sister, who was 9, taking her to and from school each day and cooking her tea. Their older brother ran away, and so did the family dog. By the time he was in his mid-teens, Kyle's mother's condition had deteriorated. She was taking drugs, lashing out, verbally abusing Kyle on a regular basis. The 2 remaining children shut themselves away in their bedroom to protect themselves and became increasingly isolated. One day, when Kyle was 15, things reached a tipping point. He fled from the house and didn't come back. Manchester has one of the highest levels of homelessness proportionate to its overall population in the UK. 30 new households a week are forced into emergency accommodation, while the number of rough sleepers has risen 13-fold since 2010. Over the same period, thanks to heavy financial and regulatory support from the local council, tens of thousands of high-end luxury apartments have been built in Manchester by private developers. So many, in fact, that the Financial Times has warned of an oversupply in the top echelons of the market. On the night when he tried to evade security and sleep in that Piccadilly station elevator, Kyle was just yards away from great swathes of empty new housing units piled up in developments like Cottonfield Wharf, which is part owned by an investment vehicle backed by sovereign wealth funds in the Gulf and headquartered in the tax haven of Jersey, or Crusader Mill, a new private housing block that received £25 million worth of state aid and boasts a secluded courtyard complete with fire pits, barbecues, Wi-Fi, and Bluetooth speakers. Like Kamal, Kyle's story is a microcosm of some of the wider dynamics that have molded the country around him over the past decade. In Kyle's case, those dynamics include an economic model rooted in financialization, marketization, and property-led regeneration that created a sharp demarcation between winners and losers. And it was presided over in Greater Manchester by a Labour council firmly embedded in the third way liberal consensus. And they include, too, the political decisions made regarding who would shoulder the burden of that economic model's failures when they came. Since Britain's austerity programme began in 2010, Oldham has been made to cut £208 million from its budget. That's 42% of its total spending. And that cut has directly impacted Kyle at every single stage of his path into homelessness. The year his mother was first diagnosed with a mental health condition, the charity Mind, which was responsible in Oldham for delivering mental health services, had its funding in the town slashed by 80%. The following year, a local initiative specifically designed to tackle youth homelessness by mediating between families and runaway teenagers was shut down completely. In the years that followed, hundreds of thousands of pounds were cut from local mental health services, adult social services, and children's care. Had different decisions been taken to insulate people like Kyle from the fallout of the financial crisis, rather than to protect the institutions and systems that created that crisis in the first place, Oldham might have been able to intervene at the various stages in which Kyle's family life got harder, preventing him from having to leave his mother in the first place. "I've lived politics," Kyle told me one afternoon, as we made our way alongside other young people to Piccadilly Station, where this time the group were planning to occupy the concourse in protest at youth homelessness and to take on any police who tried to stop them. Anyone who thinks this, all this, can carry on is mad. The Cambridge political scientist Helen Thompson has said that the post-2008 world is, in some fundamental sense, a world waiting for its reckoning. Kyle and Kamal may be strangers to one another, but both are children of the financial crisis, who have come of age alongside the disintegration of an economic status quo that previously appeared unassailable, and who discovered politics at a time when elites were trying and often failing to stitch that status quo back together. They both watched a deeply entrenched political settlement break apart in their respective countries, settlements that in different ways attempted to detach citizens from politics. In Egypt, a paternal, exclusionary state that occasionally allowed its subjects to petition leaders for concessions, but never to trespass on its private fiefdoms. In Britain, a model of liberal market democracy that claimed to transcend ideological debate, reduce electoral politics to a spectator sport, and assume the status of scientific law. Each of them saw an opportunity to exploit that fragmentation, to reanimate politics with some form of individual and collective agency that would enable them to change things for themselves, and both, albeit to drastically different degrees, are now confronted with a top-down attempt to stuff politics back inside its black box, to reseal its borders. Kyle and Kamal have both entered adulthood after the end of history, and are now ranged against political forces that use history selectively to try and cling on to power amid the storms. All this has at times enlivened them and at times mired them in a deep depression, taking a corrosive toll on their mental health. Both are still waiting for their reckoning. And just as Kyle and Kamal's conditions are at some level interlinked, so too are those responsible for containing them. In Egypt, the Sisi regime's fiercest enemy has always been the collective memory of an uprising that remains evergreen, especially in the minds of the ruling class, no matter how cleanly the walls are scrubbed of graffiti or how completely online archives of the revolution are blocked from public view. Suppression of dissent is justified by an appeal to nationalistic unity. A strong leader is the only thing standing in the way of the country's enemies, wreaking havoc. Enemies that lie both within Egypt's borders and beyond it. In Britain, a political project by the hard right to capitalize on the unraveling, one that seeks to exploit popular discontent with economic liberalism as a means of dismantling other liberalisms as well, is also rooted in the muscular assertion of ethno-cultural borders. It has likewise depended heavily on the activation of certain historical memories and the suppression of others. The leading proponents of Brexit, a process that is not solely the preserve of the hard right project, but is certainly at a leadership level entangled with it, describe their mission in terms of both imperial nostalgia and anti-imperial insurgency. We want our country back, insists Nigel Farage. Above all, we can find our voice in the world again, declares Boris Johnson. That last word, again, freighted with a meaning that dare not speak its name. There is a pattern consistent throughout history of oppressed people turning on their oppressors, said the Brexit Party's former MEP Anne Widdecombe last year. Slaves against their owners, the peasantry against the feudal barons, colonies against empires, and that is why Britain is leaving. Stuart Hall, of course, saw all this many, many years before. This is not a crisis of race, he wrote 4 decades ago, but race punctuates and periodizes the crisis. Race is the lens through which people come to perceive that a crisis is developing. It is the framework through which the crisis is experienced. It's the means by which the crisis is to be resolved. In both countries, albeit from alternative angles, narratives of colonialism are being excavated and burnished to smother more disruptive factors. In both cases, leaders attempt to legitimize themselves by rendering both invisible and hyper-visible a hazy other, traitors, enemies of the people, disruptive foreigners seeking to degrade the security and prosperity of honest, hard-working, authentic citizens lurking in the nation's midst. And in both Egypt and Britain, elite visions of power are contingent upon one another. Sisi's regime depends on the financial and military support of its sponsors in the global north and the political cover they provide him. Britain's exit from the European Union has left it more in need of other international trade partners, such as Egypt, than ever. Hence why Britain proudly boasts of being Egypt's biggest foreign investor and continues to supply Sisi's regime with arms. Hence why the red carpet was rolled out for Sisi at Downing Street only a couple of weeks ago, even as downtown Cairo was transformed into a low-key war zone ahead of that anniversary of the revolution on January 25th, with young people stopped, searched, and arrested at random on the streets, and apartment doors kicked open in midnight raids. As the writer Pankaj Mishra has observed, the barbarians, it turns out, were never at the gate. They've been ruling us for some time. So when we talk about resistance today, amid that unraveling, these are the fault lines we're faced with. On the one side, a generation afflicted with what the anthropologist David Graeber calls despair fatigue, charged with both hope and hopelessness. A generation already persuaded by virtue of their gross economic disadvantages, the repeated nullification of their voices, the knowledge of impending climate catastrophe. They're persuaded of the falsity of Thatcher's maxim, "There is no alternative," the one that Hall felt so suffocated by. A generation for whom the idea of radical change is woven into their lived experience. And on the other side, existing structures of formal power and those who occupy them, who no longer have a center ground to snap back to, and who are convinced that their survival, their salvation, lies in tacking ever further to the right, in laying new borders across the bodies of the most vulnerable, and reaching across old borders to sustain one another through the tempest. We can see those fault lines here, and we can see them in Egypt, and in the past few months alone, we've seen them rise to the surface in Chile, in Hong Kong, in Lebanon, in France and Haiti, and dozens of other countries too. People often ask if I'm optimistic about all of this, a question that seems to me somewhat to miss the point. This new landscape of political struggle contains possibilities that are emancipatory but also deeply revanchist. As Stuart himself predicted, the unraveling is taking place at the cost of immense human suffering. But it's only by understanding the contours of the new landscape that we'll be able to find within it the stories that do give cause for optimism. As Stuart himself put it, there are always energies, people, societies on the margin, those who can't express themselves within the dominant structure, whatever it is. And what is to come will come as a result of those forces who are outside, beginning to trouble, undermine, subvert, haunt the nightmares of the present, just at the moment when the present thinks it's closed. My journalistic career has always been about seeking those people, those energies, and make no mistake, they're out there, even if they rarely make the front pages of the newspapers or lead the evening news. Fresh from his battles with homelessness and austerity, Kyle, for example, has joined a radical education program called Demand the Impossible that seeks to bring together young people in open conversations about capitalism, culture, and identity, groups that have gone on, as Kyle did, to occupy public spaces, to march on the City of London, to agitate their friends. Demand the Impossible is part of a new wave of organizations and social movements, bringing together those marginalized by the old ways and emboldened by the unraveling. From private renters banding together to face down their landlords, to insurgent trade unions representing the most precarious workers, to migrant rights collectives successfully subverting the Home Office and its vicious hostile environment regime. If people are interested, we can talk about some of them in the discussion. And in Egypt, where anti-government protests are now completely outlawed and offenders liable to be swept up into mass death sentences handed down several hundred at a time by judges, Kamal thought he would never see a march through the streets again. He was as shocked as the police were when, just last September, hundreds, if not thousands, of young, mainly working-class Egyptians, people who were only children when the original revolution took place, erupted organically without any central direction to brave batons and tear gas and inevitable defeat, at least in the short term. No matter how, we'll bring Sisi down, the crowds chanted, as security forces closed in. The state reasserted itself, of course. More than 2,000 people were detained in the following fortnight, including hundreds of kids. Human rights groups believe that since his ascendancy, Sisi's regime has arrested 4,000 children. That's a statistic that speaks not of strength, but of weakness. Behind the guns and the armored vehicles, the lavish international receptions, and the photo calls with Western leaders like Boris Johnson in Downing Street, Egypt's dictatorship is terrified of history and of the future, and it's right to be. Kyle and Kamal are but small cogs in all of this. They're not revolutionary leaders or public faces. They're just two young people picking their way through the unraveling with all of the dreams and all of the disasters and all of the contradictions that involves. But they continue, despite everything, to believe in politics itself, at a time when those above them are attempting to discredit and eliminate politics altogether. Stuart Hall's friend and ally, Raymond Williams, once argued that to be truly radical is to make hope possible rather than despair convincing. And despite being laden with pain, their tales, and those of many, many others like them, do just that for me. Thank you very much.
Okay, I'm glad we had a bit of a breather after that, because I'm sure you all want time to digest what Jack said, because it was brilliant. I had a chance to read his words ahead of time, so my response is directly, responding to what he said, and his words really hit home for me. In a decade of reporting on the movement of people in and around Europe and trying to cut through official narratives and document what's really happening, listening to people from all walks of life in this country, people like Kyle, living politics, I've watched this unraveling. And I just want to go back to the Stuart Hall quote that Jack referred to, where he said, I feel out of time for the first time in my life. He went on to explain that something had turned fundamentally in the 1970s, that a system change had taken place, in which all that was solid had melted into air, and that the parameters in which political debate could take place had suffocatingly closed in. And then he said something else. It will unravel, he warned. And since that unraveling will mean the death and suffering of large numbers of people, I can't say I'm glad about that. I just wanted to remind you of that because I'm going to focus on that element in what I say today, because I feel like I've watched an unraveling and felt these suffocating limitations of my industry, of wider political debate. And I've documented the deaths and suffering of large numbers of people. But what Jack says about resistance, about hope, despite the ever-lingering presence of despair, really chimes for me. Because people don't give in so easily. They always fight back, whether or not their battles make front-page news. And so that's why now I want to kind of really zoom in and tell you the story of Carlington Spencer and the people who loved him. It's the story of a death, but it's also about resistance in the most restrictive and unlikely circumstances. So it was a Thursday in September 2017 that 32-year-old Laura finally got her baby daughter home. She'd been born 10 weeks early and spent 4 weeks in the hospital. Back at home, Laura felt like normal life was beginning to begin again. But that same day, 50 miles away, something else was happening. Laura's friend, her soulmate, her former partner fell gravely ill. His name was Carlington Spencer. Friends recall him lying motionless on his bed, dribbling, calling for help, struggling to breathe. His left arm not working, his left leg limp. Carlington was an immigration detainee, held by the UK Home Office at Moreton Hall Detention Centre, a former prison. Every year, 30,000 people pass through the UK's 10 immigration detention centres. They're prisons in all but name. The centres are operated by private sector companies for profit and the British Prison Service, while governed by Home Office rules. And the rules are that people should not be detained, or they should only be detained for a short period if deportation is imminent. There's no time limit on immigration detention. The rules say that vulnerable people who are sick, who are mentally unwell, pregnant women, people seeking asylum, people who've been tortured or raped mustn't be detained. The rules are routinely broken. All kinds of people are held for weeks, months, years even, their indefinite detention justified for administrative purposes. Conveniently for the Home Office, these centres are usually on the outskirts of society. The nearest signs of life are airports and motorways. To enter a detention centre, you need 2 forms of ID, you must surrender a fingerprint, you are subject to a search, and you can't take anything into the visitor's room with you. Not a phone, a pen, or a piece of paper. Guards once confiscated a stray hair clip found in my pocket. They also called the police and Free Burley's G4S guards while I interviewed one of Carlington's friends, but that's another story. The population in detention is transient. People are deported and people are released, and people are detained again and again. Forced into compliance, any foot wrong, and they could lose their right to citizenship. You've probably heard of Yarlswood, the prison-like centre for women, which has a well-documented history of sexual and racist abuse and medical neglect. And you may have seen the Panorama documentary on Brook House Detention Centre, where a member of staff blew the whistle and revealed a regime of racism, bullying, abuse, and violence. While Moreton Hall, where Carlington was detained, is in the same league. The sprawling complex, which holds several hundred people, is right in the heart of England, rural Lincolnshire. Carlington had completed a 2-year prison sentence in May 2017. He was immediately transferred from prison to Moreton Hall, and from there the Home Office planned to deport him. When that would be, he didn't know. The move from living in the community to prison to Moreton Hall shouldn't have brought about a dramatic change in the quality of healthcare. Prisoners and immigration detainees alike are entitled to the same quality of healthcare as anyone else, but that's not how things work in practice. Now, at Moreton Hall, Carlington lived with the stress of an uncertain future. He missed his son, and he didn't know whether he could establish visitation rights before being deported. He was worried about his own health, which seemed to be going downhill. Laura noticed the swelling first. Carlington's entire body seemed to expand. His face was puffy. Carlington was a warm, funny, upbeat man, not one for complaining, Laura told me later. It wasn't really until he went to Moreton Hall that he started to complain, she said. My last visit was at the end of August. He was telling me about his ankles. Every week I'd been going up until then, and I'd seen his ankles still swollen. He was moaning because he had cataracts in his eyes, and he had finally got an appointment to go and get that looked at, but they wanted him to be chained up to go. Chained up. At the time, it was common practice at Moreton Hall that when they took someone to hospital, they would routinely chain them up to guards on a long leash. Laura's final visit to see Carlington at Moreton Hall was at the end of August. After the complications with the birth of her daughter, she had to stay away for a while. The baby arriving 10 weeks early had meant that she had to spend 4 weeks in hospital. But when at last her baby was released on Thursday, the 28th of September 2017, there came a worrying phone call. The caller was a man who had been detained at Moreton Hall and was now free. He had spoken to other men locked up at Moreton Hall. They said Carlington was ill and that he'd had a stroke. Laura didn't know the man, and she supposed maybe it was just rumours, people trying to make trouble. So she called Carlington. No answer. She sent texts. Are you all right? I haven't heard from you. Nothing. She called Moreton Hall. Though she'd been a regular visitor that summer, staff refused to tell her anything. They said they couldn't, since Carlington had no next of kin details on file. Andrew had been at Moreton Hall for a month when Carlington arrived, and they fell into an easy friendship. A struggle with alcohol had marked both their lives. They talked and cooked together, and they both avoided the canteen. They didn't like the food. Instead, they brought food from the centre shop, rice, flour, tinned mackerel, tinned veg, and they cooked in one of the 2 microwaves. A slight man with intense light eyes and dark, close-cut hair, Andrew had been born in the West Indies. His parents migrated to America and left him behind to protect him from the shit going down in the States. And when he was 14, they sent him to England to live with an auntie. Throughout his teenage years, Andrew mostly looked after himself. He came of age, made trouble, made music, wrote poetry, had 4 children, went to prison. Once in prison, Andrew set about making up his education. He took courses and discovered an interest in computing and software design. Andrew is 47 now and sober. When they were together in Moreton Hall, Andrew could see the shocking decline in Carlington's health. The eye problems, the swollen ankles that Carlington was always scratching, the body sores, some breaking open. Carlington had put on so much weight that his prison clothes were too tight. Andrew told me that Carlington's medication had been withdrawn, and he'd argued with nurses about it and made 2 complaints to healthcare. All this made Carlington feel more vulnerable. Carlington had also told Andrew that he'd signed a form to return to Jamaica. So why, Andrew wondered, did they continue to detain him? And if they were going to keep him there, why neglect his health? Late in September, Carlington brought Andrew some poems to craft into lyrics for a reggae song. The following week, Carlington was dead. In the days leading up to Carlington's death, his friends at Morton Hall knew they had to record what went on. And in doing so, they not only provide detailed evidence of medical neglect, official lying, probable cover-up, but they challenge the culture of disbelief embedded in this country's immigration system. It's an official narrative enforced by the media and our politicians through careless rhetoric and punitive migration policy making. So Carlington's friends wrote out statements and faxed them to detention centre solidarity groups who shared the details online and with a few journalists. With limited access to computers and email at Morton Hall, handwriting statements and faxing them was actually the quickest way to get the story out. Their work took place against the backdrop of the Home Office trying to deport witnesses, of Morton Hall losing CCTV footage of the corridor where Carlington was held, and the local police conducting an investigation into Carlington's death and not interviewing a single person who was detained with him. So here's what they say happened in the final days of Carlington's life. A softly spoken Jamaican man named Joseph was detained on the Fry unit alongside Carlington and had gotten to know him well in the short time they were locked up together. When Carlington was feeling down about not seeing his then 5-year-old, Joseph encouraged him to put another application to stay in the UK. 2 or 3 days after he helped him to print out and photocopy the application, Joseph said Carlington had already received a rejection from the Home Office. Carlington seemed down and looked sad. I felt his pain, Joseph said. We all knew what it was like when your application is refused by the Home Office, when all we want to be is with our loved ones. In an effort to cheer him up, Joseph invited him to a Jehovah's Witnesses meeting. He'd been trying to get him along for a while. That meeting took place on Thursday, the 28th of September. Shortly before they went along to the meeting, Carlington checked his blood sugar levels. The reading was 20. The reading should have been between 8 and 10. Joseph said he chided his friend and took away a bottle of fizzy energy drink he'd found in his room. Carlington took some insulin and they went to the meeting. Carlington didn't seem into it. He fell asleep while the others discussed the Bible verse and eventually said goodbye and left the session early. Later that day, early in the evening, a man named Jabbar heard a loud banging from the cell across the corridor from his room. It was Carlington's room. Jabbar got up and crossed the hall. It looked like Carlington was having a panic attack. He was asking for help in a slurred voice. Now, attached to Carlington and Jabbar's unit, there's an office where 1 or 2 guards are usually stationed, so Jabbar called for help. A crowd gathered outside Carlington's room. Andrew arrived and pushed past the crowd and looked in on his friend. Several Morton Hall officers turned up. Both Andrew and Jabbar said they saw healthcare go into the room, and Jabbar asked them, "What's wrong with Carlington?" And the officer replied, "He's having a spice attack." And spice is a synthetic form of cannabis with severe side effects and is rife in prisons and immigration lockups. It's also something guards will often use if they think they don't believe someone is ill, they'll accuse them of taking drugs. So another detainee died at Morton Hall, a man originally from Sierra Leone, and officers believed he had taken spice too, though it turned out to be that he had a brain injury. Andrew walked in and saw Carlington lying face up on his bed. He looked wrong, Andrew said. He was convinced that Carlington had suffered a stroke, and he told officers so. The officers insisted it's not serious, it's just a spice attack. Both Andrew and Jabbar went back to check in on Carlington before lockup around 9 p.m. Using Carlington's own blood sugar testing kit, Jabbar tested Carlington's blood sugar and reported a reading of 15.4, and a while later, perhaps a quarter of an hour, 22.6. They told the guards all this information. Jabbar said a medical team was sent for and tried to talk to Carlington. I'm quoting him now. He said, I said to them, he looks like he had a stroke. I said to them, if you don't do something, he will die. And they were not happy at that. They all started talking at the same time and accused me of exaggerating and went into his room for about 10 minutes where they were asking Mr. Spencer to stand up, and he was not responding. The reason I'm giving you so much detail is because again and again, several of Carlington's friends and his fellow detainees told Officer what had happened. They documented what they witnessed, and still, each time, they were ignored. The next day, Carlington was still ill. No one had still called an ambulance. Jabbar could hear Carlington calling out from his room. He looked through the slot in the door, and he saw Carlington lying on his side in front of the cell, on the floor of the cell. He said his speech was slurred. When an officer turned up, Jabbar became really upset, and they started to argue about what should be done. Jabbar said, look, can we just call an ambulance? Around 9 a.m., Andrew went down to Carlington's room. By this time, Carlington had been moved onto his bed, and he was still. Andrew tried to make a joke through the slot, but Carlington didn't smile. His face was twisted, and there were tears on his cheeks. Worried, Andrew went to the office and asked a guard to call healthcare. They said healthcare knew about Carlington, and they were on their way. Laura told me that when Carlington was sober, he was the sort of person that everyone liked. That's the Carlington known to his friends at Morton Hall, and it's one reason why so many people got involved when Carlington fell ill, and why so many gathered outside his room on Thursday and Friday, even after guards asked them to leave. When I met Spencer, he was a bubbly, kind person, very outgoing, the kind of person who makes your day go by. Do you know what I mean? Says TJ. Now, TJ was only 21, but he'd formed a brotherly friendship with Carlington, who plaited his hair and cooked food for him. TJ saw Carlington just before afternoon lockup on Saturday. On Friday. TJ said, I was thinking, this ain't professional. You can clearly see the guy was in pain. I'm telling them, this ain't right. His left leg is not working. His left arm is not working. His face is bruised. He's really not communicating. It's not rocket science to know that he is not all right. TJ got into an argument with guards. He's quite a loud and feisty guy, so it caused a lot of attention, and by now there were lots of people outside Carlington's room. Someone went to healthcare to complain, and just before the unit was locked up, guards told Jabbar that Carlington was booked in to see healthcare at midday. Carlington's friends at this stage decided among them that they would create a commotion and make noise and protest in order to get Carlington the help that he needed. Andrew, at that point, told TJ to write down everything and make a note of what was happening and to get all staff names and badge numbers. Someone set up a fire alarm. TJ told me afterwards, we were arguing with the guards. I still remember their badges to this day. Just a lot of misconduct, I'm not going to lie. There was one security guard there that showed a little bit of sympathy, but she knows that there was something wrong and that something could have been done more. She said that she's got a black boyfriend, so that's the reason why we shouldn't be saying, oh, you lot are racist. But we weren't saying they were racist. We were just saying, rah, the way you treat people. An ambulance eventually arrived. It was 2 p.m., at least 18 hours since Jabbar had heard the loud banging from Carlington's room. Carlington was taken to Lincoln Hospital and then moved to Queen's Medical Centre in Nottingham. He was accompanied by guards from the private security company Tasker, that's part of the Capita Group. The guards stayed with him at the hospital until one doctor begged them to please unchain him because he was not going anywhere. On the Saturday, Laura left her baby daughter with her mum and drove to Derby to the hospital. She was told that Carlington had a blood clot and blood on the brain and that would need operating on, but they had to wait for his blood pressure to stabilise. She told me quietly that she was glad she did because she got to speak to him and see him, and she thinks he might have known it was her. Laura tells me about an advert that she's seen recently about what to do when someone has a stroke. You've got to act fast. Fast, she said again. Her face crinkles into an incredulous smile. That's all you've got to do. You've got to act fast. On the Monday after Carlington went into hospital, Laura got a call from the Home Office. They said that Carlington was not fit to be detained and would be released from detention. Laura and her mother assumed this meant he'd be coming home. But later that day, she found out that Carlington was in fact brain dead. This is often something that the Home Office will do. They'll release people into detention as they're on their deathbed so that the death is not recorded as someone who's died in state custody. Back at Morton Hall, among the detainees, there was incredible confusion in the aftermath of Carlington's death. People were transferred, deportation attempts were made, some people were released. 2 people who had witnessed what had happened were put on suicide watch. Someone else attempted to kill himself. Andrew put in a request to be moved because he didn't feel safe. 2 months after Carlington's death, a 27-year-old man named Aram Bakr from Iraq was found dead at Morton Hall. Still grieving Carlington in the aftermath of his death, Andrew wrote to management questioning how they had handled Aram's case. I'm just skipping through. Carlington's funeral was held in Jamaica, and the Home Office paid for his body and possessions to be shipped to Jamaica. Part of the reason Laura spoke to me is because she wants Carlington to be seen as a real person and not just another person who was locked up. He's dead now, so who cares? And now the funeral is over and her little girl is getting bigger. She's considering joining some of the protests against immigration detention centres. I'm sure we can close some of them down in our lifetime, she told me, laughing. The reason why I wanted to spend so much time on Carlington's death is that the sorts of people that, like Carlington and the people who were detained with them, their voices are rarely heard in reports about immigration detention. Instead, all you hear is they're foreign rapists and murderers. But actually, these are, many of them, people with family in the UK who've made a mistake and who don't get another chance and deported to countries they haven't seen for decades sometimes. The way they responded to Carlington's death in that moment, it meant that instead of the usual story about someone taking drugs and getting sick and then dying, which is what the Home Office would have put out, that was resisted because they documented exactly what happened. So in the inquest verdict, we were able to hear the evidence from the detainees and their deportations were halted as a result. I'm going to stop now because I know I've gone over time, but perhaps we can talk more about this in the questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca. That was incredible. Yusef, it's all you. Would you like to?
Hello. Thank you for sitting and listening. Thank you, everyone, and for our earlier talks. I feel like I'm an academic, innit? That's why I think I'm academic. So in true academic kind of style, I haven't prepared anything formal. But also being asked to speak at an event about resistance and being an academic in this moment left me a lot to think about, because I don't know if many of you have had much experience of academia or university settings, but despite a lot of radical rhetoric, they tend to be by nature very conservative, small c conservative institutions. Most of our days are built around work allocation models now, which oftentimes are filled with administrative tasks which are a bit like a road to nowhere. They're sort of activities, and I said this recently to one of my managers, probably to my detriment, which are oftentimes kind of designed to fill space, but never really take anything anywhere or affect anyone or anything in a meaningful way. And I hope, obviously, that doesn't get me sacked, but it's the truth. So what can I say about resistance? And over time in different places and spaces that I've, through my work as kind of academic and a PhD student, I've engaged in things that perhaps are more formally understood as forms of resistance. So I worked for a time at the Global School at the University of Sussex. And we did a lot of stuff there about peer education. We even ran some peer education projects in places like Brixton, Southwark, places like this outside into community settings. And I know some of that work did influence some activism in the style that we were sort of talking about today, student protests, occupations. A lot of those students were involved in the protests at Yarlswood. But again, I felt like, although I was involved maybe in preparing and, offering radical perspectives to those students, I wasn't there. I didn't go to Yarlswood. I didn't, occupy anything for different reasons. The same way I've done some work teaching students around, the tragedy at Grenfell. And my friend actually is here today, my friend Loki was really, really, really crucial in offering some guest lectures and people from the community teaching about the things that had happened there and how and why that was so important to everyone, not just in Britain, but globally, how that was really connected fundamentally to the kind of political economy of the time, the moment. And again, I felt like that was very formal, sense or idea of what resistance means. And I also felt like that is a struggle that so many people are telling and kind of fighting so well, that perhaps that isn't the right thing for me to speak about here. And I think kind of the main thing that I took from Jack's book, reading it, was that everything is political. As much as we're told, and things or sections and areas of our lives are made to feel depoliticized or not political, but actually the political is everywhere. It's in our family lives, it's in our relationships. It mediates, these histories mediate all of these things. And I talk often about there sort of being two sides to history. There's the history that we tell in the moment and in the present, which is which is in a sense a social construct. And then there's the kind of tacit history that kind of lives on the underbelly of that history. The things that we don't speak about and the things that perhaps aren't clearly articulated, but they exist and they live with us very, very clearly. Like those legacies of colonialism, for example, that remain with us in the present, but perhaps we're not so clear, or the story we tell about colonialism, the popular story we tell about colonialism, isn't that one. And that violence continues through that tacit history or that tacit embodiment of that history in the present tense. And it made me think about a conversation I had recently. And this is why I've been kind of so damning at the academy, because I had a conversation with one of the boys in the neighborhood. So I come from Brixton. Oftentimes I'll stop and speak to young people that I've known since they were in nappies, And sort of these conversations are kind of usually kind of punctuated by like a, what do they call them? What are they called, those mobile phones that they use? Yeah, so one of their basically their drug lines ringing. So these conversations are punctuated by their drug lines ringing and them going off to sell another drawer or whatever they're doing. And I sat down recently and it was a night where a young person had been stabbed outside the Brixton Academy. And I sat down with a young person and we were talking about what his aspirations were for the future and what his future might look like. And, in true kind of, do-gooder style, I was trying to talk to him about things that he could do or things that, could take him away from what he's doing at present. And he sort of said to me, well, do I think anything that I do is having a positive effect on people like him? Am I helping people like him? And I had to think very hard, and I thought about the work of another academic whose work I really appreciate, Ian McGimpsey, who talked about the financialization of the youth sector and the way in which market logics and market forces have forced their way into these spaces where really are spaces where we're supposed to be trying to help and support people. And actually what's happening now is that these have become essentially entrepreneurial spaces where, let me help you by helping myself. To this funding call or to this, opportunity. It's become kind of opportunity help or opportunity support, where young people actually aren't at the forefront. The young people are the commodity who are being accessed. And the people that are really helping themselves oftentimes are the professionals that are delivering services. And that's not a condemnation of all professionals that are delivering services, because many of them deliver really important and vital services, but it's a condemnation of the system which alienates those professionals from those young people. And I had to think again. So if no one's helping these young people, because I'm not claiming to be helping them, who's helping them and what are they doing? And I think the form of resistance that I kind of want to get down to is the resistance in the DIY culture that they're doing themselves. And I think that isn't recognized enough, because a lot of the times the resistance that they turn to, or the forms of resistance that they turn to, we consider to be problematic. And it doesn't mean that I endorse all elements or all aspects, of the behaviours they demonstrate. But what I do see, and what I do see among the young people that I've worked with, so my context is obviously road life or street culture in the UK, is them cultivating spaces online, in the real world, where they can have real conversations, where they can highlight issues that are truly pertinent to them, where they can have fun. And I think that was something, I remember there's a passage in your book where you're interviewing Jeremy Corbyn, and he talks about we don't have enough artists. We don't have enough people that are here to truly enjoy themselves, and the way the economy has shifted has kind of prevented and alienated people from those true qualities that they might have. And I suppose I could link that more broadly to kind of the demonization of something like, I don't know if you've heard of the subgenre of rap music called drill music, and the ways in which these young people doing it for themselves and helping themselves isn't really recognized as a form of resistance, but it's also still being met with extreme state backlash and oppression, where they're being given rap bans for things that they say on songs rather than guidance and support, where they're being put in prison, where they're being hyper-policed. I don't know, I went recently, we've been doing some interviews with rappers, and I recently took a friend who does the Surviving Society podcast, Tiso, to Brixton, and we were driving through the Angeltown estate, past, Loughborough, and he said, I've seen so many police, I've never seen more police than this in my life, in such a concentrated area. And those stories aren't being told, the ways in which these young people that are kind of facing up to some of the hardest edges of the state, these are young people, that their stories oftentimes do connect with the stories at Yarlswood. Some of the boys in the neighbourhood have, on committing crimes or being arrested, been deported. We've never seen them again. So when we're talking about these young people and their DIY culture and the ways that they're resisting, they truly are taking on the hardest edge of the state. And I think the thing that I would urge, and the response that kind of I took from your book, is that everything is political, and we should recognize what our young people and people coming through in one of the most difficult political economic times in Britain in recent history are doing, which is political, and we should celebrate and encourage them in that. And I suppose that's all that I wanted to say, really. Thank you very much.
Would you like to respond before I should I?
Thank you. Look, I'll respond very, very briefly, because I feel like we've taken up loads of time, but just one thing that seems to unite everything that we've talked about, and thank you both so much for your responses, is this question of whose stories are told, and whose experiences and whose narratives get to form part of our discourse. And I feel like we've collectively done a lot to depress everyone here today, which is probably not what you signed up for. But I think the thing we would all like to get across is that those stories are out there. And to give one tiny example of reasons for optimism and stories which can be told that kind of build towards an idea of, as I was referring to earlier, Stuart saying different histories, different energies, different communities, disrupting this kind of complacent present. A really good example would be something like United Voices of the World, which is an insurgent trade union that is operating predominantly in London, but increasingly beyond that, that is not part of the TUC. It doesn't have a general secretary. It doesn't have any of the resources or coverage that most bigger trade unions have, and trade unions find it hard to get any kind of coverage at all these days. But United Voices of the World represents traditionally workers who are the most precarious. They are outsourced, they are often migrant workers, they are on minimum wage, they are the people who clean our offices, sweep our streets, guard our buildings, and they are winning victory after victory after victory. On Friday the 13th of December, the day in which Boris Johnson celebrated his election win, and many on the left and on the progressive side of the political spectrum felt despair, UVW was racking up yet another triumph when the people who clean the royal parks, these are essentially the Queen's cleaners, won their battle for better paying conditions and a proper living wage. In my book, I talk about a woman called Fatima Jallow who works for the Ministry of Justice. She's operating at the heart of Westminster, but her story is never told when we get Westminster coverage kind of in the papers and on the news. And she is helping to lead a strike wave with UVW against the outsourcing company that employs her and against the Ministry of Justice, the government of this country that employs the outsourcing giant. And I think that the point, about all of this is that it's not that those stories aren't there. It's not that those flickers of resistance are silent. It's that they are not being foregrounded. And so through all of our work, whether it's journalism, whether it's academia, I think our job is to kind of move the spotlight and shine a different gaze. And in a way, that's the best we can hope for right now, but that's a hell of a lot. And we can build from that. And I think that's something that Stuart's work spoke to, and I think that he would see today if he was still with us.
Absolutely. Really, thank you for this, the entire panel. And what I've been thinking a lot about today are the ways in which these kind of everyday acts, these movements, these moments where you show love, where you show solidarity, where you put something up on a wall, you talk to people, you listen to their stories, those are also acts of love. Every time a moment of resistance happens, it's an act of love for everyone. And it's for us, and also an act of courage, right? Because any moment, whether it be a kind of everyday form of resistance, be it standing on the corner in a place where you're not supposed to be, or shifting a discourse and saying, okay, we're going to organize in this way, in a way that hasn't been tried before. It ends up being a kind of way in which we see the chipping away of all of these things and the unraveling that Stuart talked about happening every day. And the cost is really high and it takes courage, but we see how it's happening all around us. And that's where we have to really build upon and take hope. And now I have so much I could say, but what I'd really much rather do is to open it up for conversation and to hear what people are thinking about, what your questions are, what your comments are. So I'm happy to take a cue. I'm happy to kind of point you out. So raise your hand if you'd like to say something, if you have a question, if you have a comment.
Hi.
Hi.
Thanks so much. It was really interesting, just such a range of stories on the panel. My question is just from the last thing that I was thinking about listening to Yusef. I'm just going to ask a really direct question that I want to hear more about. You were talking about drill as a form of resistance and how that, I think that's what you mentioned, and how that is disregarded and often demonized, but how much potential and how much legitimacy you think there is in that. And I'd just love it if you could speak a bit more to that, because I think it is so exciting and relevant. Thank you.
Yeah, and would you mind, Yusef, can we take a few questions and a few comments, and then we'll kind of respond, because I want to see our time. We've kind of got cut into the rest of our time. Is there anybody else who had a question? Yes. Hi.
Hello. Hi. Since the media is also corrupt, what means of communication beyond just people who are likely to buy books or people who are likely to go to cool art galleries, people who are already switched on to radical thought, since the media is so corrupt, what means of communication do you think we should use, all of you, to spread these ideas so our enemies don't win next time?
And maybe we'll take one more, and then we can open up, and then we can come back to you. Is there anybody else? Yes. We've got a gentleman right here. Sorry.
Thank you. It's not question, just it's one point about the first lecture was about Egypt. The part about some explanation she explained about the Lebanon. Something is happening in Iran, and we have a big movement there. And there is a relationship between Iraq, Iran, and Lebanon, because three of them are fighting against mullahs in Iran. Iran, for example, in Lebanon, people are fighting against Hezbollah. In Iraq, they are fighting against Hashd-e-Shabi. And in Iran, the people are fighting against Supreme Leader Khamenei. But the big boss of them, the big boss of the terrorism in Middle Eastern countries are Mr. Ayatollah Khamenei. the point is this, because the all information about the Egypt was from 2011, I think anarchists in Lebanon, anarchists in Iraq, and anarchists in Iran, they have a new movement and they have new ideas about revolution. But newspapers and in the West, especially in the West, there's not good information about them because the left parties are leading the newspaper and journalism. All the information are wrong, it's not correct. That was the only point I was.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks. Would you like to respond? Yusef?
Yeah, so drill music. I think that not all of the content of drill music is explicitly political. And I've been actually interviewing rappers recently and asking them if they think what they do is political. And I've had mixed responses, some saying very much so. Okay, is that better? Yeah, so I've been interviewing rappers recently and asking them if they think what they do is political. And the responses have been mixed. The reason I say I think drill music is essentially political because it represents young people carving out a space. And it's a kind of cultural, it's an online and it's a physical space as well. And I think some of the content of drill music I don't approve of, and I think some of the artists don't approve of either. And I think part of some of the negative conversations that have been kind of connected to drill music is about young people. There's a really, really powerful, we were talking about it just before actually, article by Bell Hooks about gangster rap. And this is sort of set in the kind of early 90s US context, but I think it holds true to now. And she talks about bigotry in gangster rap, and she says that if you look at your society more broadly, if you think about what happens at the margins, the problems in your society will be performed in a more acute fashion at the margins. And it says more about a society that wants to pay young black and brown people, consume them embodying a kind of form of violence and things like that. So that's what I think oftentimes causes some of the kind of more negative images that come through in drill music, is in the sense that these young people have been denied opportunities in so many other spaces, that they embody the thing that can be commodified and the thing that they can do to make sort of progress in their careers, I suppose. But I actually think that drill music, like other forms of UK, black influenced music, really are political. And I think they're political because they, represent against, state sanction, in the face of state sanction very often, with very little formal help or support. They represent young people carving that space and that voice and a kind of movement. And maybe it's not recognized as a social movement, in the way that other social movements are recognized, but I recognize it as one in that sense. So I think that innately, drill music and UK rap music are political. And I also think that you find political, deliberate political messages push through that genre. And the other final thing probably I'd say is that even the music that I think is problematic, because it's involved in kind of local forms of violence, you've got to understand that as being part of also value systems that have been cultivated in the face of oppression and marginalization. And what they've realized is those value systems can be monetized. So you've got street value systems that are being monetized through the platforms that are available today. So I would argue, yes, it is innately political. It's not without problems, but it is innately political.
Sure. You don't want it? Just quickly on the media one, thank you for the question. I think for me personally, I understand why you talk about the media being corrupt. I think the connotation that many people would have with that is the notion of sort of journalists receiving, money in brown envelopes and being directed to write stories accordingly. And I think by and large, that's not the case. In fact, what the media struggles with is something a lot more insidious, which is that it's not that journalists are being bribed to write particular stories, or even that media institutions as a whole are being paid to kind of direct their coverage in a particular direction. It's that both the institutions and the journalists are passively bought into ruling and dominant ideologies which reinforce the idea of markets, reinforce the limits of political possibilities, and have done a really bad job of navigating and covering the breakdown in the kind of neoliberal consensus that we've seen in the past decade or so. In my book, I use the analogy of baseball correspondents in the American South in the 1930s and 40s, whose job it was to cover everything that was going on within that sport, and they did their job incredibly dutifully. They reported on the transfers between the teams and the outcomes of the matches and the dramas of each game. And what they never mentioned, with a few very honourable exceptions, was that baseball was racially segregated at the time, or that there was a nascent civil rights movement going on that was going to transgress that colour line and change the country's history. They operated within the boundaries of the system they were reporting under, and that is the problem that we have with journalism today, along with the fact that the ownership of our biggest media institutions are, by and large, those who are most invested in capital and the status quo. We're running out of time, but give money to and read and support things like Open Democracy, which Rebecca works for, as well as Madamas, which is in Egypt, that was mentioned by Bahia, and also give money to fantastic trade unions like United Voices of the World, who will always welcome contributions to their strike fund.
Yes, and really, we have to listen to the voices as people are talking, as people are doing embodied protest. Yes. Can I take any more questions? Is it okay if how are we doing? I've got one more question. May I take two more questions, because I see two people. So 1 and 2. There you go. Yeah, we can, absolutely, just as long as we take the two, absolutely. Oh, okay, sorry.
Hi, thanks very much for your thoughts. It's been really interesting to listen. My name's Mansek. I'm from a platform called Naked Politics, which is about engaging young people in politics. I think it's been really interesting to hear about different forms of resistance. How useful is resistance sitting outside of more traditional forms of politics? So I think that young people and other marginalized groups have been really great at creating all these interesting spaces and having all these interesting conversations that we haven't seen before, but it hasn't obviously translated electorally into much necessarily to be hopeful about. So where does resistance sit in terms of, traditional politics?
Hi, can you hear me? Yeah, is it working? I was thinking that one of the huge bits of unraveling that's going on is our climate. And none of you have mentioned that, although young people are so involved in that. So I would just like to know in what ways you think those connections might be made, particularly since you've been speaking so much about international dimensions.
Does anyone want to take?
Have you got time? Is the mic working? Yeah. Hi, I'll keep it brief. I wanted to ask the panel about self-care, in particular with respect to what Jack said about despair fatigue. Sorry, I get really nervous when I talk, but I'm exhausted. I think part of it's for personal reasons. I work for a local authority. I'm a children's social worker. I screen cases to do with, South London, domestic violence, youth problems, children, all day, every day. And then in my personal time, I think I feel so tired, But what I'm trying to say is, when you're feeling despair, fatigue yourself in your own personal lives, and you're thinking, how can I get some resolve here and keep fighting, Is there anything you do to kind of pick yourselves up? I suppose that might be, really personal stuff. but maybe coming from a movement perspective, to keep going, to keep informing yourself and, yeah, that's it. Yusef, were you trying to think of the word for trap phones? Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Okay, so maybe we can have 3 minutes each to, or maybe 1 minute each to respond.
Just take the climate change question. So we have published a lot of work on open democracy around Stansted 15, the group of protesters who it was a mix of anti-deportation protesters and environmental activists, and they started to link up their campaigns. So they linked up with the things I was talking about, immigration detention. Their analysis, they basically, their campaigns around, they linked what was happening with the climate and the expansion of a London airport with a charter flight, and they managed to stop a flight from happening. I'm not saying it very eloquently, but we have published a lot of their work, why they did what they did on open democracy, so you can read about that. But there are, within our work, we are thinking about the links between the different campaigns. If you want to say more about that.
Resistance outside of formal politics, I think I agree that there are limitations to it. I think, though, that there's lots of communities that for a long time haven't had great representation or access to formal politics, and they've had to organise outside of those spaces in order to win any recognition in formal politics at all. And I think you talk a bit in the book, I don't want to cannibalize what you might have to say, but a bit in the book about the way we, it's like the idea of hegemony and the way that has to be won on the streets and in communities. And I think formal politics actually wouldn't recognise people or marginal groups unless it's really forced to. And I think for that reason, organisation has to go on even if there isn't a feeling that it's being recognised, because why would they if they don't have to?
Yeah, I mean, there's would be so much to say on all three of those questions, all of which are brilliant. I mean, just to link the last two, when it comes to self-care, I think many of us felt after the election, especially, somebody used the analogy of an electric shock, and I hadn't realized this before, but when you get an electric shock, your body, your brain is literally being overwhelmed with information. Electricity is a signal which travels through the nervous system, and the reason you feel shock is because your brain is being flooded with too much electricity and too much information. And I think for many of us, not just with the election, but really with the past decade of both hope and hopelessness, it's swinging wildly emotionally between different political poles, we felt like our bodies and our brains have been overwhelmed with too much information, and it has left us with exhaustion. And for me, there's a million things to say about self-care which we don't have time to go into, but for me, one of the things that accentuates that is the fact that increasingly we are living in atomized societies, that we don't have those communal spaces, we don't have those collective movements, we don't have the physical rooms which we gather in and build links with one another, kind of self-supporting links and mutually supporting links. And so we have to seek out the networks, even if they are loose and even if they are fragile, that replicate that. And things like trade unions, things like renters collectives, things like local community-based organizations, I think can help provide that. We can't privatize our self-care. Our political project has to be collective, and our way of sustaining ourselves through that political project has to be collective as well, and that's where I look for those kind of things.
And can I also say that in terms of self-care, Audre Lorde said that self-care is a radical political act, and I think it's something we have to keep in mind. With regard to the climate question, I mean, if we look at also the most repressive regimes across the world right now, a lot of them are deeply connected to hyper-extraction of resources. And people are making that connection. They're making that connection in the protests in India. They're making that connection in Brazil. They're making that connection here. Greta Thunberg is making it across the world. We've got places where people are making those connections that we have to make, and they're so urgent. And we really have to begin to push, not just sort of, ourselves, doing projects around consumption, which I think is not the solution, but we have to push through politics and through other resistatory means this agenda that says, look, actually dictatorship and capitalism go along with climate change, and it's affecting all of us. And we will not have any hope unless we continue and push back and make sure that these things change.
I've got one more thing.
Yeah.
So there's one thing that finally, just on the self-care and despair, is that one of the things, so that article that you referred to in my introduction is about the mum pain, and the mum pain is essentially feeling marginalized, and the different ways that those historical legacies of injustice, colonialism, racism, class inequalities, all of these things lead to young people living everyday lives that are painful in the most microscopic ways, in their intimate relations, in their everyday interactions, all of these ways it makes their life painful. But I also say that that is the starting point of their struggle, that they're made to feel so awful about themselves and their circumstances that they feel no choice but to fight, that there's nothing else they can do but fight. And sometimes those struggles take them into terrible places, but sometimes those struggles are productive. So if you think about despair as also that starting point of that point in struggle, is that, all right, if this is how bad I feel and this is how bad it can get, I must do something about this. And I think that that is another way to think or conceive of the idea of despair or defeat or pain or suffering.
Yeah, and survival. You know, we as Romani people, I mean, one of the things that we do is we really work to give love and to give support, even in the face of genocide, in the face of everyday destruction of our communities. And so this is the only way we're going to survive, and that's resistance as well. All right, thank you, everybody. We went way over, and it's terrible.
It's a huge pleasure to welcome the jazz pianist Nikki Yeoh to close this year's Stuart Hall Public Conversation. Since she emerged on the British jazz scene in the mid-90s, Nikki has proved to be an accomplished improviser and composer who's not afraid to push the boundaries of jazz piano. And I had the great fortune, thanks to Malcolm, to seeing Nikki premiere her new trio Jack Café Oran last year as part of the International Piano Trio Festival. And her musical passion, her prodigious talent, and political energy was so evident on that evening. I couldn't think of anyone better to complete our afternoon of debate and discussion on the topic of resistance. So please join me in welcoming Nikki Yeoh.
Good afternoon. I've been here for a few hours before performing, and it's been an amazing, incredible afternoon. And what was striking to me as I was trying to think about what to play for you is that I feel like we need to do a little bit of healing in the world. I think you probably would agree. So maybe we could start in this room. I don't know how you feel about this, but just for a minute, before I play this piece, the piece is called The Healer. Before that, if those of you that can stand, that would really be great. Thank you. Oh, you guys are awesome. Thank you. Okay. Oh, that was unplanned, but it broke the ice, you know. That's jazz. Okay, so if the people on this side of the room, if we can tune into a frequency, and if we can hum together or sing, that would be amazing. I'm going to give you the note. Feel free to close your eyes. And we're focusing on healing as we're humming. Okay? This is the note. Keep it going, but don't forget to breathe. And then can we have this note? That's awesome. You can sit down now. Thank you. This piece is called The Healer. Thank you very much. Thank you. You guys are an amazing choir, by the way. I think I'm going to have to take you around with me on every gig. Okay, I was going to do another piece, but I think I'm going to do this piece instead. Okay, so this next piece is about love. Yay! Okay, it's got a bit of a story to it. Would you like to hear the story? Yes? Are you sitting comfortably? Then I shall begin. Okay, so there's a man bear and a woman bear in a forest. Yeah, stay with me. Yeah? The man bear, he sees the woman bear and he really wants to dance with her. So he goes over to her to ask her to dance, and then he realizes he can't because he's a bear. Bears don't talk. But then he suddenly remembers, oh yeah, there's bear language. And in bear language, if you start to dance, that also means, would you like to dance? So he does. He's quite small. He's a small guy. So he's dancing, little dance steps. And as she gets up, he realizes she's quite a big bear. You know, she's quite tall, she's a big, he loves that. He's like, wow, she's just confident bear. And he's also like, he's quite a deep guy as well. So it's all about the inner bear. It really is. So her dance steps are a bit heavier than his. And you'll see this in the music. But he's also a gentleman. So he changes his dance steps to fit hers. You'll also see that in the music. He's an amazing guy. He does the washing up. He never forgets a birthday. It's like he's a figment of somebody's imagination, you know. Anyway, after that little dance, they fall in love. Oh, yes, yes. So I wrote this tune when I was 19, and at the time I was like, that's it. And then that's what happens. They fall in love, and it's wonderful. And as I'm a little bit older now, right, I realise that sometimes that doesn't always happen, right? You fall in love, and then it can be a bit rocky, or it could just be amazing all the time. Kids go to uni, they spend your money, but they don't graduate, and actually they've just been partying all the time. All of those things can happen, right? So in the actual improvisation section of this piece, it changes every time with whoever's in the audience. So they could fall in love, it could go a bit, you know, Pete Tong, it could do all those things, but it depends on the vibe that you guys bring to the piece. So I'll ask you at the end of the piece, did they make it? All right? All right? It's called The Dance of the Two Small Bears. That's super obvious, but that's what it's called. Thank you. So what do we think, guys? Did they make it? Just about, right? Absolutely. Yeah, I don't know if I want any more information about their troubles because they seems a bit like, yeah. Okay, but yeah, a bit troubles, but they made it. That's good. Okay, so a couple of things. I'm playing in London on the 18th of March at the Steinway Jazz 2 Piano Festival with an amazing pianist called Zoe Rahman. It would be brilliant if some of you guys could come down. That's in Soho, Pizza Express. You can eat a pizza and listen to some music. And there's only a 100-seater, and half the tickets are gone. So if you want to come, please do come along, but make sure you book early. And then if any of you guys are based in the Northeast, I'm playing at Sage Gateshead on the 22nd of March. And I'm only saying this because my manager's over there. He will kill me, literally, if I don't tell you. Okay. As I was sitting down and I was listening to you guys, a lot of them incredible speakers, I suddenly reminded of a song that I arranged, a Nina Simone song that I arranged for Carleen Anderson. And I'm not a singer at all. But I thought today is the day to share that song with you guys. So I'm going to go for it. Oh, yeah. My skin is black. My arms are long. My hair is woolly. My back is strong. Strong enough to take the pain inflicted again and again. What do they call me? My name is Aunt Sarah. Aunt Sarah. My skin is yellow. My hair is long. Between two worlds, I do belong. My father was rich and white. He forced my mother one night. What do they call me? My name is Saffronia. Saffronia. My skin is tan. My hair is fine. My hips entice you. My mouth is like wine. Whose little girl am I? Anyone who has money to buy. What do they call me? My name is Sweet Thing. Sweet Thing. Sweet Thing. My skin is brown. My manner is tough. I kill the first mother that I see. My life has been so rough. I'm awfully bitter these days because my parents and their parents and your parents, and her parents, and his parents were slaves. What do they call me? My name is Resistance.